Good evening, friends, and welcome to Sleepy Time Tales, a podcast aimed at helping you to get a good night's sleep. This is a podcast where I read old books, sometimes fiction, sometimes non-fiction, in the most boring way I can, to try help slow your spinning mind enough for you to fall asleep in the most natural way possible. The stresses of life often follow us to bed and keep us company, but I'm here to distract you from them and help you drift away. But before you do, if you find Sleepy Time Tales helpful and you would like to support me to help me keep this show going out to you and thousands of your fellow insomniacs, please consider supporting on the Patreon at patreon.com/sleepytimetales. If monthly is a bit much, you can also put a tip in the tip jar in the Ko-Fi. These are both linked in the show notes. Or you can support Sleepy Time Tales by simply spreading the word. If you know someone who's struggling to sleep, just tell them about it and leave it at that. So let's get to tonight's story. We are picking up with Bellarion the Fortunate, where he is getting involved in a plot that seems way above his head. So snuggle down, close your eyes, breathe deeply and listen closely as I lead you down the path to sleep. We return this week to Bellarion the Fortunate by Rafael Sabatini. And he too now smiled, a smile so oily and cynical that Bellarion set him down at once for a man without ideals, and mistrusted him from that moment. But he was strategist enough to conceal it, even to reflect something of that same cynicism in his own expression, so that Barbaresco, believing him a kindred spirit, should expand more freely. And meanwhile he drew a bow at a venture. That which Her Highness looks to me to obtain is some explanation of your inaction. He chose the most non-committal word, but it roused the Lord Barbaresco almost to anger. Inaction? He choked, and his plethoric countenance deepened to purple. To prove the injustice of the charge, he urged his past activities, of which he thus rendered an account. Luring him thence by skillful question, assertion, and contradiction, along the apparent path of argument upon matters of which he must assume the young man already fully informed. Gradually Bellarion drew from him a full disclosure of what was afoot. He learned also a good deal of history of which hitherto he had been in ignorance, and he increased considerably in his not very elevating acquaintance with the ways of men. It was an evil enough thing which the Princess Valeria had set herself to combat, with the assistance of some dispossessed Guelphic gentleman of Montferrat, the chief of whom was this Lord Barbaresco. And it magnified her in the eyes of Bellarion that she should evince the high courage necessary for the combat. The extensive and powerful state of Montferrat was ruled at this time by the Marquis Theodore, as regent during the minority of his nephew Gian Giacomo, son of the great Ottone who had been slain in the Neapolitan Wars against the House of Brunswick. These rulers of Montferrat, from Guglielmo, the great crusader onwards, had ever been a warlike race, and Montferrat itself a school of arms. Nor had their proud, belligerent nature been diluted by the blood of the Palaiologhi who were on the death without male issue of Giovanni the Just 100 years before. These dominions had passed to Theodore I, the younger son of Giovanni's sister Violante, who was married to the Emperor of the East, Andronicus Comnenus Palaiologus. The present regent Theodore, however, combined with the soldierly character proper to his house certain qualities of craft and intrigue rarely found in knightly natures. The fact is, the Marquis Theodore had been ill-schooled. He had been reared at the splendid court of his cousin, the Duke of Milan, that Gian Galazzo, whom Francesco de Cara had dubbed the Great Viper, in allusion as much to the man's nature as to the columbine emblem of his house. Theodore had observed and no doubt admired the subtle methods by which Gian Galeazzo went to work against those whom he would destroy. If he lacked the godlike power of rendering them mad, at least he possessed the devilish craft of rendering them by their own acts detestable, so that in the end it was their own kin or their own subjects who pulled them down. Witness the manner in which he had so poisoned the mind of Alberto of Este as to goad him into the brutal murder of almost all his relatives. It was his aim thus to render him odious to his Ferrarese subjects, that by his extinction Ferrara might ultimately come under the crown of Milan. Witness how he forged love letters, which he pretended had passed between the wife and the secretary of his dear friend Francesco Gonzaga, Lord of Mantua, whereby he infuriated Gonzaga into murdering that innocent lady, who was Galeazzo's own cousin and sister-in-law, and tearing the secretary limb from limb upon the rack, so that Mantua rose against this human wolf who governed there. Witness all those other Lombard princes who by fraud and misrepresentation, ever in the guise of a solicitous and loving friend, he lured into crimes which utterly discredited them with their subjects. This was an easier and less costly method of conquest than the equipping of great armies, and also it was more effective, because an invader who imposes himself by force can never hope to be so secure or esteemed as one whom the people have invited to become their ruler. All this the Marquis Theodore had observed and marked, and he had seen Gian Galeazzo constantly widening his dominions by these means, ever increasing in power and consequence, until in the end he certainly would have made all of northern Italy a kingdom for his footstool, had not the plague pursued him into the castle of Meleagno, where he had shut himself up to avoid it, and there slain him in the year of grace 1402. Trained in that school, the Marquis Theodore had observed and understood many things that would have remained hidden from an intelligence less acute. He understood, for instance, that to rise by the pleasure of the people is the only way of reaching stable eminence, and that to accomplish this, noble qualities must be exhibited. For whilst men singly may be swayed by vicious appeals, collectively they will respond only to appeals of virtue. Upon this elementary truth, according to Barbaresco, the Marquis Theodore was founding the dark policy which from a merely temporary regent during the minority of his nephew should render him the absolute sovereign of Montferrat. By the lavish display of public and private virtues, by affability towards great and humble, by endowments of beneficences, by the careful tempering of justice with mercy where this was publicly desired, he was rendering himself beloved and respected throughout the state, and step by step with this he was secretly laboring to procure the contempt for his nephew, to whom in the ordinary course of events he would presently be compelled to relinquish the reins of government. Nature, unfortunately, had rendered the boy weak. It was a weakness which training could mend as easily as increase, but to increase it were directed all the efforts which Theodore took care should be applied. Corsario, the tutor, a Milanese, was a venal scoundrel, unhealthily ambitious. He kept the boy ignorant of all these arts that mature and grace the intellect, and confined instructions to matters calculated to corrupt his mind, his nature, and his morals. Castruccio, lord of Fenestrella, the boy's first gentleman in waiting, was a vicious and depraved Savoyard who had gamed away his patrimony almost before he had entered upon the enjoyment of it. It was easy to perceive the purpose for which the regent had made him the boy's constant and intimate companion. Here Bellarion, with that assumption of knowledge which had served to draw Barbaresco into explanations, ventured to interpose a doubt. In that matter, I am persuaded that the regent overreaches himself. The people know that he permits Castruccio to remain, and when they settle accounts with Castruccio, they will also present a reckoning to the regent. Barbaresco laughed the argument to scorn. Either you do not realize Theodore's cunning, or you are insufficiently observant. Have not representations been made already to the regent that Castruccio is no fit companion for the future Lord of Montferrat? or indeed for any boy. It merely enables Monsieur Theodore to parade his own paternal virtues, his gentleness of character, the boy's willfulness, and the fact that he is, after all, no more than regent of Montferrat. He would dismiss, he protests, Messer Castruccio, but the prince is so devoted and attached to him that he would never be forgiven. And after all, is that not true? I suppose it is, Bellarion confessed. Barbaresco was impatient of his dullness. Of course it is. This Castruccio has known how to conquer the boy's love and wonder for pretending qualities that fire youth's imagination. The whole world would hardly have yielded a better tool for the regent, or a worse companion for the little prince. Thus were the aims of the Marquis Theodore revealed to Bellarion, and the justifications for the movement that was afoot to thwart him. Of this movement for the salvation of her brother, the Princess Valeria was the heart, and Barbaresco the brain. Its object was to overthrow the Marquis Theodore and place the government in the hands of a council of regency during the remainder of Gian Giacomo's minority. Of this council, Barbaresco assumed that he would be the president. Sorrowfully, Bellarion expressed a doubt. The mischief is that the Marquis Theodore is already so well established in the respect and affection of the people. Barbaresco reared his head and threw out his chest. Heaven will befriend a cause so righteous. My doubt concerns not the supernatural, but the natural means at our command. It was a sobering reminder. Barbaresco left the transcendental and attempted to be practical. Also, subtle change was observed in his manner. He was no longer glibly frank. He became reserved and vague. They were going to work, he said, by laying bare the region's true policy. Already they had at least a dozen nobles on their side, and these were laboring to diffuse the truth. Once it was sufficiently diffused, the rest would follow as inevitably as water runs downhill. And this assurance was all the message that Bellarion was invited to take back to the princes. But Bellarion was determined to probe deeper. That, sir, adds nothing to what the Lady Valeria already knows. It cannot allay the anxiety in which she waits. She requires something more definite. Barbaresco was annoyed. Her Highness should learn patience, and should learn to trust them. But Bellarion was so calmly insistent that at last Barbaresco angrily promised to summon his chief associates on the morrow, so that Bellarion might seek from them the further details he desired on the Lady Valeria's behalf. Content, Bellarion begged a bed for the night, and was conducted to a mean, poverty-stricken chamber in that great empty house. On a hard and unclean couch he lay pondering the sad story of a wicked regent, a foolish boy, and a great-hearted lady who, too finely reckless to count the cost of the ill-founded, if noble enterprise, to which she gave her countenance, would probably end up destroying herself together with her empty brother. Chapter 7. Service. Stimulated by the insistence of this apparently accredited and energetic representative of the princess, Messer Barbaresco assembled in his house in the forenoon of the following day a half-dozen gentlemen who were engaged with him upon that crack-brained conspiracy against the regent of Montferrat. 4 of these, including Count Enzio Spigno, were men who had been exiled because of Guelphic profession and had returned by stealth at Barbaresco's summons. They talked a deal, as such folk will, but on the subject of real means by which they hoped to prevail they were so vague that Bellarion, boldly asserting himself, set about provoking revelation. Sirs, all this leads us nowhere. What indeed am I to convey to her Highness? Just that here in Casale, at my Lord Barbaresco's house, some gentlemen of Montferrat hold assemblies to discuss her brother's wrongs. Is that all? They gaped and frowned at him, and they exchanged dark glances among themselves, as if each interrogated his neighbor. It was Barbaresco at last who answered, and with some heat. "You try my patience, sir. Did I not know you accredited by Her Highness, that I would not brook these hectoring airs? If I were not so accredited, there would be no heirs to brook." Thus he confirmed the impression of one deeper than they in the confidence of Lady Valeria. "But this is a sudden impatience on the Lady Valeria's part," said one. "It is not the impatience that is sudden, but the expression of it. I am telling you things that may not be written. Your last messenger, Goffredo, was not sufficiently in her confidence. How should she have opened her mind to him? Whilst you, sirs, are all too cautious to approach her yourselves, lest in a subsequent miscarriage of your aims there should be evidence to make you suffer with her." The first part of that assertion he had from themselves. The second was an inference, boldly expressed to search their intentions. And because not one of them denied it, he knew what to think, knew their aims amounted to more, indeed, than they were pretending. In silence they looked at him as he stood there in a shaft of morning sunlight that had struggled through the curtain of dust and grime on the blurred glass of the mullioned window. And then at last Count Spigno, a lean, tough, swarthy gentleman, whose expressions had already revealed him the bitterest enemy there of the Marquis Theodore, loosed a short laugh. "By the host, he's in the right." He swung to Bellarion. "Sir, we should deserve the scorn you do not attempt to dissemble if our plans went no further than—" The voices of his fellow conspirators were raised in warning, but he brushed them contemptuously aside. A bold, rash man. A choicely posted arbalist, well, he got no further. This time his utterance was smothered by their anger and alarm. Barbaresco and another laid rough hands upon him, and through the general din rang the opprobrious epithets they bestowed upon him, of which fool and madman were the least. Amongst them they cowed him, and when it was done they turned again to Bellarion, who had not stirred from where he stood, maintaining a frown of pretended perplexity between his level black brows. It was Barbaresco, oily and crafty, who sought to dispel, to deviate any assumption Bellarion might have formed. "Do not heed his words, sir. He is forever urging rash courses. He too is impatient, and impatience is a dangerous mood to bring to such matters as these." Bellarion was not deceived. They would have him believe that Count Spigno had intended no more than to urge a course, whereas what he perceived was that the Count had been about to disclose the course already determined, and had disclosed enough to make a guess of the remainder easy. No less did he perceive that to betray his apprehension of this fact might be never to leave that house alive. He could read it in their glances as they waited to learn from his answer how much he took for granted. Therefore he used a deep dissimulation. He shrugged ill-humouredly. "Yet patience, sirs, can be exceeded until from a virtue it becomes a vice. I have more respect for an advocate of rash courses," and he inclined his head slightly to Count Spigno, "than for those who practice an excess of caution whilst time is slipping by." "That, sir," Barbaresco rebuked him, "is because you are young. With age, if you are spared, you will come to know better." "Meanwhile," said Bellarion, completely to reassure them, "I see plainly enough that your message to Her Highness is scarcely worth carrying." And he flung himself down into his chair with simulated petulance. The conference came to an end soon afterwards, and the conspirators went their ways again singly. Shortly after the departure of the last of them, Bellarion took his own, promising that he would return that night to Messer Barbaresco's house to inform him of anything Her Highness might desire him to convey. One last question he asked his host at parting. The pavilion in the palace gardens is being painted. Can you say by whom? Barbaresco's eyes showed that he found the question odd, but he mentioned that most probably one Gobbo, whose shop was in the Via del Cane, would be entrusted with the work. Into that shop of Gobbo's, found by inquiry, Bellarion penetrated an hour later. Old Gobbo himself, amid the untidy litter of the place, was engaged in painting an outrageous scarlet angel against a star-flecked background of cobalt blue. Bellarion's first question ascertained that the painting of the pavilion was indeed in Gobbo's hands. My two lads are engaged upon it now, my lord. Bellarion winced at the distinguished form of dress, which took him by surprise until he remembered his scarlet suit with its imposing girdle and gold-hilted dagger. The work progresses all too slowly, said he sharply. My lord, the man was flung into agitation. It is a beautiful fresco and they require assistance, these lads of yours. Assistance? The old man flung his arms to heaven. Where shall I find assistance with the skill? Here, said Bellarion, and tapped his breast with his forefinger. Amazed, Gobbo considered his visitor more searchingly. Bellarion leaned nearer and lowered his voice to a tone of confidence. I'll be frank with you, Sir Gobbo. There is a lady of the palace, a lady of her highness. He completed his sentence by roguishly closing an eye. Gobbo's lean brown old face cracked across in a smile, as becomes an old artist who finds himself face to face with romance. You understand, I see, said Bellarion, smiling in his turn. It is important that I should have a word with this lady. They are grave matters. I will not weary you with these and my own sad story. Perform a charitable act to your own profit. But Gobbo's face had grown serious. If it were discovered, he was beginning. It shall not be. That I promise you full confidently. And to compensate you, 5 ducats. 5 ducats? It was a great sum, and confirmed Master Gobbo in the impression made by Bellarion's appearance, dress, and manner, that here he dealt with a great lord. For 5 ducats, he broke off and scratched his head. Bellarion perceived that he must not be given time for thought. Come, my friend, lend me the clothes for the part, and a smock such as proper, and you keep these garments of mine in pledge for my safe return, and the 5 ducats that shall be yours. He knew how to be irresistible, and he was fortunate in his present victim. He went off a half hour or so later in the garb of his suddenly assumed profession, and bearing a note from Gobbo to his sons. Late in the afternoon, Bellarion lounged in the pavilion in the palace garden, to which his pretense had gained him easy admission. He mixed some colors for the 2 young artists under their direction, but beyond that he did nothing save wait for sunset, when the light would fail and the 2 depart. Himself, though not without the exertion of considerable persuasions based upon a display of his amorous intentions, he remained behind to clear things up. Thus it happened that, as the Lady Diorana was walking by the lake, she heard herself addressed from the bridge that led to the pavilion. Madonna, gracious Madonna. She turned to behold a tall young man with tumbled black hair and a smear of paint across his face, in a smock that was daubed with every color of the rainbow, waving a long-handled brush in a gesture towards the temple. Would not Her Highness, he was asking, graciously condescend to view the progress of the frescoes? The Lady Dianara looked down her nose at this greatly presumptuous fellow, until he added softly, and received news at the same time of the young man she befriended yesterday. That changed her expression, so swiftly and ludicrously, but Bellarion was moved to silent laughter. To view those frescoes came the Lady Valeria alone, leaving Monna Dionara to loiter on the bridge. Within the temple, Her Highness found the bedaubed young painter dangling his legs from a scaffold and flourishing a brush in one hand, a mahl stick in the other. She looked at him in waiting silence. He did not try her patience. "Madonna, you do not recognize me." With the sleeve of his smock, he wiped the daub of paint from across his features, but already his voice had made him known. "Messer Bellarion, is it yourself?" "Myself." He came to the ground, to command. But why this? Why thus? Her eyes were wide. She was a little breathless. "I've had a busy day, Madonna, and a busy night, and I've more to report than may hurriedly be muttered behind a hedge." "You bring messages?" "A message amounts to nothing. It is only to say that Messer Goffredo, fancying himself followed and watched on the last occasion, is not to be induced to come again. And in the meanwhile, nothing has happened of which it was worthwhile to inform you. Messer Barbaresco desires me further to say that everything progresses satisfactorily, which I interpret to mean that no progress whatever is being made." "You interpret." And I venture to add, having been entertained at length, not only by Messer Barbaresco, but also by the other out-at-elbow nobles in this foolish venture, that will never progress in the sense you wish, nor to any end but disaster." He saw the scarlet flame of indignation overspread her face. He saw the anger kindle in her great dark eyes, and he waited calmly for the explosion. But the Lady Valeria was not explosive. Her rebuke was cold. "Sir, you presume upon the messenger's office. You meddle in affairs that are not your concern." "Do you thank God for it?" said Bellarion, unabashed. "It is time someone gave these things their proper names, so as to remove all misconception. Do you know whither Barbaresco and these other fools are thrusting you, Madonna? Straight into the hands of the strangler." Having conquered her anger once, she was not easily to be betrayed into it again. "If that is all you have to tell me, sir, I will leave you. I'll not remain to hear my friends and peers maligned by base knave, to whom I speak by merest accident." "Not accident, Madonna." His tone was impressive. "A base knave I may be, but base by birth alone. These others, whom you trust and call your peers, are base by nature." "I'll wait. It was no accident that brought me," he cried, and this with a sincerity from which none could have suspected the violence he did to his beliefs. "Ask yourself why I should come again to do more than is required of me, at some risk to myself. What are your affairs, or the affairs of the state of Montferrat, to me? You know what I am and what my aims. Why then should I tarry here? Because I cannot help myself. Because the will of heaven has imposed itself upon me." His great earnestness, his very vehemence, which seemed to invest his simple utterance with a tone of inspiration, impressed her despite herself, as he intended that they should. Nor did she deceive him when she dissembled this in light derision. An archangel in a painter's smock. By Saint Hilary, that is nearer the truth than you suppose it. She smiled, yet not entirely without sourness. "You do not lack a good opinion of yourself." "You may come to share it when I've said all that's in my mind. I have told you, Madonna, whither these crack-brained adventurers are thrusting you, so that they may advance themselves. Do you know the true import of the conspiracy? Do you know what they plan, these fools? The murder of the Marquis Theodore." She stared at him round-eyed, afraid. "Murder?" she said in a voice of horror. He smiled darkly. "They had not told you, eh? I knew they dared not. Yet so indiscreet and rash are they that they betrayed it to me of whom they know nothing save that I carried as an earnest of my good faith your broken half-ducat." What if I were just a scoundrel who would sell to Marquis Theodore a piece of information for which he would no doubt pay handsomely? Do you still think that it was accident that brought me to interfere in your concerns? I can't believe you. I can't. And again she breathed, aghast, that horrid word, murder. If they succeed, said Bellarion coldly, all would be well. Your uncle would have no more than his deserts, and you and your brother would be rid of an evil incubus. The notion does not shock me at all. What shocks me is that I see no chance of success for a plot conducted by such men with such inadequate resources. By joining them, you can but advance the regent's aims, which you believe to be the destruction of your brother. Let the attempt be made and fail, or even let evidence be forthcoming of the conspiracy's existence and true purpose, and your brother is at the regent's mercy. The people themselves might demand his outlawry or even his death for attempt upon the life of a prince who has known how to make himself beloved. But my brother is not in this, she protested. He knows nothing of it. Bellarion smiled compassionately. Qui bono fuit? That is the first question which the law will ask. Be warned, Madonna. Dissociate yourself from these men while it is time, or you may enable the regent at a single stride to reach his ultimate ambition. The pallor of her face, the heave of her breast were witnesses to her agitation. You would frighten me if I did not know how false is your main assumption, that they plot murder. They would never dare to do this thing without my sanction, and this they have never sought. Because they intend to confront you with an accomplished fact. Or you may believe me, Madonna, in the last 24 hours, and chiefly from these men, I've learned much of the history of Montferrat, and I've learned a great deal of their own histories too. There is not one amongst them who is not reduced in circumstances, whose state has not been diminished by lack of fortune or lack of worth. For this she had an answer, and she delivered it with a slow, wistful smile. You talk, sir, as if you contained all knowledge, and yet you have not learnt that the fortunate desire no change, but labour to uphold the state whence their prosperity is derived. Is it surprising, then, that I depend upon the unfortunate? Say also the venal, those greedy of power and of possessions, whose only spur is interest, desperate gamblers who set their heads upon the board, your own and your brother's head with theirs. Almost they divided amongst themselves in their talk the offices of state. Barbaresco promised me that the ambition he perceived in me should be fully gratified. He assumed that I too had no aim but self-aggrandizement, simply because he would assume no other reason why a man should expose himself to risks. That told me all of him that I required to know. Barbaresco is poor, she answered. He has suffered wrongs. Once in my father's time he was almost the greatest man in the state. My uncle has stripped him of his honours and almost of his possessions. That is the best thing I have heard of the Marquis Theodore yet. She did not heed him, but went on. Can I desert him now? Can I? She checked and stiffened, seeming to grow taller. What am I saying? What am I thinking? She laughed, and there was scorn of herself in her laugh. What arts do you employ, you, an unknown man, a self-confessed starveling student, base and nameless, that upon no better warrant than your word I should even ask such a question? What art, said he, and smiled in his turn, though without scorn. The art of pure reason based on truth. It is not to be resisted. Not if based on truth, but yours is based on prejudice. Is it prejudice that they are plotting murder? They have been misled by their devotion, by their cupidity, Madonna. I will not suffer you to say that. Anger flared up again in her, loyal anger on behalf of those she deemed her friends in her great need. She checked it instantly. Sir, I perceive your interest, and I'm grateful. If you would still do me a service, go, tell Messer Barbaresca from me that this plot of assassination must go no further. Impose it upon him as my absolute command. Tell him that I must be obeyed, and that, rather than be a party to such an act, I would disclose the intention to the Marquis Theodore. That is something, Madonna. But if when you have slept upon it— She interrupted him. Upon whatever course I may determine, I shall find means to convey the same to my Lord Barbaresco. There will not be the need to trouble you again. For what you have done, sir, I shall remain grateful. So go with God, Messer Bellarion. She was turning away when he arrested her. It is a little personal matter, this. I am in need of 5 ducats. He saw the momentary frown, chased away by the beginnings of a smile. You're consistent in that you misunderstand me, though I have once reminded you that if I needed money for myself, I could sell my information to the regent. The 5 ducats are for Gobbo, who lent me the smock and these tools of my pretended trade. And he told her the exact circumstances. She considered him more gently. You do not lack resource, sir. It goes with intelligence, Madonna, he reminded her as an argument in favor of what he said, but she ignored it. And I'm sorry that You shall have 10 ducats, unless your pride is above. Do you see pride in me? She looked him over with a certain haughty amusement, a monstrous pride, an overweening vanity in your acuteness. I'll take 10 ducats to convince you of my humility. I may yet need the other 5 in the service of your highness. The service, sir, is at an end, or will be when you have conveyed my message to the Lord Barbaresco. Bellarion accepted his dismissal in the settled conviction that her highness was mistaken, and would presently be glad to admit it. She was right, you see, touching that vanity of his. And at the end of that chapter, I'm calling it a night. As always, if you would like to read the original, you can find it on Project Gutenberg at the link in the show notes. Thanks again for joining me on this episode of Sleepy Time Tales, the podcast designed around a bedtime story to help you to get a restful night. New episodes will be released every Sunday night to give you something fresh to help you rest in a new week. But make sure to follow or subscribe in whatever service you use so that you get your new episodes when they come out. Good night, and sweet dreams.